The wind was a blade against the world, sharp enough to peel the bark from the pines and scour the optimism from a man's soul. It was this wind that drove the final mail stagecoach into the town of Redemption with the urgency of a soul-fleeing damnation. The iron-rimmed wheels groaned to a halt in the muddy slush of the main street, the horses steaming and wild-eyed, their breath pluming like smoke from a dying fire. The driver, a man named Jebediah, whose face was a roadmap of hard winters, did not even bother to announce his arrival. Anyone with sense was already indoors, battening down hatches against the coming fury. The sky overhead was the color of a fresh bruise, low and heavy with the promise of a blizzard that would choke the mountain pass for weeks, if not months. When the coach door swung open, it was not a weary traveler or a hopeful prospector who emerged. It was a woman, or the ghost of one, clad in a wedding dress. The dress was not a confection of lace and silk, but a simple thing of homespun white cotton, now sullied and streaked with the grime of a long journey. A tear in the hem spoke of a frantic escape, and the mud that clung to her worn leather boots told a story of roads that were more memory than reality. She stood there for a moment, a pale specter in the graying afternoon, trembling so violently it seemed the wind might simply disassemble her. Her name was Claire, and she had come to marry a man she had never met. The few townsfolk who had braved the cold to witness the stage's arrival fell into a thick, charged silence. They saw the wedding dress, the dirt, the terror in her wide, haunted eyes. Whispers began to circulate before she had even taken a full breath of Redemption's frigid air. Then, Sheriff Dunley pushed through the small crowd. He was a broad, stoic man, his face weathered by the high-altitude sun and the burdens of his office. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that felt jarringly out of place. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the wind's shriek. "Are you Miss Claire Abernathy?" She could only nod, her throat a knot of fear and cold. Her gaze darted from the sheriff to the watching faces, seeing not welcome, but a chilling mixture of pity and suspicion. The sheriff's next words fell like stones into the silence. "I'm afraid I have some terrible news for you. There was an incident this morning, up at the Miller Ranch." He paused, his gaze softening with a practiced sort of sorrow. "Mr. Jacob Miller, he's dead." The world seemed to tilt under Claire's feet. The faces of the townsfolk blurred into a single, monstrous entity of judgment. Dead. The word was an absurdity. The letters she held in a small, worn satchel, tied with a blue ribbon, were filled with his life, his plans, his hopes for their future. He had written of the sturdiness of his new barn, the loyalty of his dog, the vastness of the sky under which they would build their life. He could not be dead. How? The word was a faint, cracked whisper, stolen by the wind as soon as it left her lips. Sheriff Dunley's expression hardened. He was a lawman again. The brief moment of sympathy extinguished. He was found in his bed, stabbed. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. A woman, Martha, who ran the dry goods store, crossed herself. Another man spat a wad of tobacco into the mud, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the woman in the dirt-streaked wedding dress. A bride arriving on the very day her intended was found murdered in his bed. The coincidence was too sharp, too cruel to be ignored. The whispers grew louder, venomous things that coiled in the freezing air. "She's cursed," one man muttered, just loud enough for Claire to hear. "Brought death with her on the wind." "Look at her," Martha hissed to her husband. "Like a banshee in white, a murderess, I tell you." Claire felt the weight of their words like physical blows. She swayed, her vision tunneling, the edges darkening. She had run from one hell only to find herself at the gates of another. The sheriff took her arm, his grip firm but not unkind, steadying her. "You'll come with me, Miss Abernathy," he said, his voice brooking no argument. He led her away from the stagecoach and the prying eyes, toward the squat, solid building that served as his office and the town's jail. The wind tore at her simple veil, whipping it across her face. Inside, the warmth of a pot-bellied stove was a shock to her frozen skin. The room was sparse and functional, a desk cluttered with papers, a gun rack on the wall, and 2 cells with iron bars at the back, both empty. The sheriff poured her a cup of coffee, black and bitter, from a tin pot. Her hands shook so much she had to use both to hold the mug. "I need to ask you some questions," Dunley began, sitting behind his desk. He did not invite her to sit. She told him everything, her voice thin and reedy. She spoke of the correspondence with Jacob Miller, arranged by her cousin back east. She spoke of her previous life, a carefully edited version that omitted the parts too shameful, too painful to voice. She told him of her journey, of selling the last of her meager possessions to afford the ticket. She had nothing, and now she had no one. Her story was simple, pathetic, and, to the sheriff's experienced ear, entirely plausible. There was no guile in her terror. When she was finished, he let out a long sigh, running a hand over his tired face. "The storm is closing in. No one is getting in or out of this valley until it breaks. Could be days, could be a week or more." He looked at her, his gaze direct. "The people in this town, they're spooked. A murder is bad enough, but this, it feels like a bad omen to them. They don't want you here." Claire's heart sank. "Where am I supposed to go?" "Ordinarily, you'd stay at the boarding house, but Mrs. Gable won't have you. Says you're bad luck. No one will." He looked toward the barred cells. "I can't rightly keep you in there. You've committed no crime that I can see, but I can't let you stay out on the street, either. Not in this weather." He stood and walked to the window, peering out at the first flakes of snow, thick and wet, beginning to fall. "I'm only letting you stay in town for the night. You understand? One night. We need to find you a place." He seemed to be talking more to himself than to her. He pulled on his heavy coat, his brow furrowed in thought. He was a man caught between his duty and the superstitious fear of his constituents. Finally, an idea seemed to settle in his mind, though he did not look pleased with it. "There's one person who might," he said, his voice laced with reluctance. "He lives on the edge of town, keeps to himself, won't care what the gossips are saying because he doesn't listen to them." The sheriff turned back to her. "His name is Elias Thorne. I'll go and ask him. You wait here." He left her alone in the suffocating warmth of the office. She sat on a hard wooden bench, the coffee untouched, growing cold in her hands. She was a parcel, an unwanted piece of luggage to be deposited somewhere until she could be sent away. She closed her eyes, and the image of a smiling man from a small, faded photograph, the only likeness she had of Jacob Miller, rose in her mind, only to be replaced by the dark, accusing eyes of the townsfolk. Elias Thorne was splitting wood when he saw the sheriff's lumbering form approaching through the thickening snow. Each swing of the axe was a punctuation mark in the howling symphony of the wind. The motion was fluid, powerful, a rhythm born of long practice and deep-seated anger. It was a task that allowed him to not think. The sharp crack of splitting pine was a satisfying sound that momentarily drowned out the ghosts that whispered in the quiet moments. He set the axe down as Dunley reached the small clearing in front of his cabin. The cabin itself was a reflection of its owner, weather-beaten, solitary, and fortified against the world. It stood apart from the town, with its back to the encroaching forest and a clear view of the pass, as if always watching for an enemy. "Sheriff," Elias said, his voice rough from disuse. He did not invite him in. "Elias?" Dunley greeted, pulling his collar tighter against the wind. "Storm's looking to be a bad one." "It is." The pleasantries were exhausted. Dunley got straight to the point. "A woman came in on the stage, the one who was supposed to marry Jacob Miller." Elias's expression did not change, but a flicker of something, interest, perhaps, or just surprise, stirred in his dark eyes. He had heard the news of the murder. Of course, news, like the cold, had a way of seeping under every door in Redemption. Her name is Claire Abernathy, the sheriff continued. She has nowhere to go. The whole town has shut its doors to her. They think she's some kind of witch who brought this blizzard down on us along with a murder. Elias picked up a piece of split wood, examining it as if it held the answers to a complex puzzle. And what do you think? I think she's a terrified woman who just lost the only future she had. But what I think doesn't matter right now. I can't leave her out in the street, and I can't lock her up. I need someone to take her in, just until the storm passes and I can figure out what to do with her. Elias finally looked at the sheriff, his gaze cold. Why me? Because you're the only one in this town who doesn't give a damn about gossip and bad omens. And because you owe me. The words hung in the air between them. Elias's jaw tightened. He glanced down at his hands. The skin on his knuckles and across the backs was a latticework of old scars, puckered and pale, the ghost of a fire that had taken everything from him. Dunley had been the one to pull him from the wreckage of his former life. It was a debt he had never wanted. But it existed all the same. He gave a curt, reluctant nod. One night, Elias said, his voice flat. Until the storm breaks, Dunley corrected. Bring her things. She doesn't have much. When the sheriff brought Claire to the cabin, the snow was already beginning to pile in drifts against the fences. The wind howled with a new, more savage intensity. Elias stood in the open doorway, a tall, forbidding silhouette against the dim lamplight inside. He looked at her with an unnerving stillness, his eyes taking in the pathetic sight she presented, a woman in a ruined wedding dress, holding a small satchel that contained all her worldly possessions. He said nothing, simply stepped back to let her enter. The interior of the cabin was as stark as its owner. It was a single room, impeccably clean but bare. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a fire crackling within it, casting long, dancing shadows. There was a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves holding a few books and some basic provisions. The air smelled of pine, wood smoke, and solitude. He'll see you're safe, the sheriff said to Claire, his voice unnaturally loud in the small space. He looked at Elias. I'll check in when I can. Then he was gone, shutting the door behind him, leaving them sealed in together. The silence that descended was heavier than the snow piling up outside. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the relentless shriek of the wind against the log walls. Claire stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of what to do. Elias moved past her, his presence large and unsettling in the confined space. He did not look at her. There's stew in the pot, he said, gesturing toward the hearth. You can sleep there. He pointed to a small pile of furs and a spare blanket near the fire. It was not a question or an offer, but a statement of fact. Claire was cautious but polite. Thank you, Mr. Thorne. He did not reply. He sat at the table, his back to her, and began to clean a rifle with meticulous, focused movements. He was a man surrounded by walls, and the logs of his cabin were only the most visible of them. Claire ate the stew, which was hot and nourishing, though she could barely taste it. She was acutely aware of every small sound she made, the scrape of the spoon against the bowl, the rustle of her dress. He remained at the table, a cold, closed-off island of a man. The storm rattled the windows, and the cabin groaned under the assault. But the tempest inside the small room was of a different nature entirely, a storm of silence, grief, and suspicion. They did not speak another word, when she could no longer bear the tension. Claire lay down on the makeshift bed by the fire. The warmth felt good on her chilled bones, but sleep was a distant country she could not reach. She listened to the howl of the wind and the steady, rhythmic sound of Elias oiling his rifle. She was trapped in a town that hated her, in a cabin with a stranger who clearly resented her presence, and by a storm that was burying the world in white. Eventually, exhaustion claimed her, But sleep offered no refuge. It dragged her back into the darkness she had fled. The walls of the cabin melted away, replaced by the cloying floral wallpaper of another room. A room filled with the scent of whiskey and rage. A man's voice, thick and slurred, whispered cruelties in her ear. A hand, heavy and hard, clamped down on her shoulder. The feeling of being cornered, of being powerless, rose in her throat like bile. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The hand tightened, shaking her, and the world fractured into a kaleidoscope of terror. Claire woke with a raw, piercing scream that tore through the quiet cabin. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom touch still burning on her skin. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the room was cast in deep shadow. A figure moved in the darkness. Elias was on his feet, his own bed abandoned. He had been awake. For a moment, he just stood there, a dark shape against the faint orange glow. He had been shaken from his own haunted thoughts by her cry. He moved to the water bucket, his movements quiet and deliberate, and filled a tin cup. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, holding it out. "A nightmare," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low, stripped of its earlier coldness. She took the cup, her hands still trembling. Their fingers brushed for a fleeting second. She felt the rough, scarred texture of his skin. She drank the cool water, the simple act grounding her in the present, pulling her back from the abyss of her memories. When she looked up at him, the shadows cast by the dying fire played across his face, but she could see his eyes. They were no longer cold or distant. In their depths, she saw a flicker of something she did not expect, a deep, shadowed well of concern that he would never, ever voice. It was the look of a man who was no stranger to nightmares himself. He took the empty cup from her and retreated back to the shadows of his own corner without another word. But the small gesture, the shared moment of vulnerability in the dead of night, had changed something between them. A tiny crack had appeared in the wall of his solitude. As Claire tried to calm her racing heart, a memory, sharp and unwanted, surfaced in her mind. It was not of the nightmare itself, but of what had come before. Her first husband, a man whose love was a cage, his words a whip. She remembered the day he had locked her in the cellar for a perceived slight, the damp, cloying darkness, a mirror of the despair that had become her life. She had escaped him, but the prison was one she still carried inside her. Across the room, Elias sat on the edge of his bed, staring into the embers. The fire. It always came back to the fire. In his mind's eye, he saw the flames, impossibly bright and hungry, devouring the ranch he had built with his own 2 hands. He saw the face of his neighbor, a man named Henderson with whom he had a dispute over water rights, watching from a distance, a smirk playing on his lips. There had been no proof, nothing the law could act on. But Elias knew. He knew the fire had been set deliberately. It had taken everything, his home, his livestock, his future. It had left him with nothing but the burns on his hands and a guilt that gnawed at him, a guilt for not being able to protect what was his. Outside, the wind had died down, replaced by a profound and eerie silence. The world had vanished. Claire rose and went to the small window, wiping away the condensation with the sleeve of her dress. There was nothing to see but a solid, unending wall of white. The snow had risen past the windowsill. It was a soft, silent tide, erasing the landscape, burying the town, sealing them in. They were on an island, a tiny wooden ark in a vast, frozen sea. They were trapped, for days, maybe longer, just the 2 of them, with their ghosts and the crushing weight of the snow. The first day bled into the second with no discernible change. The world outside the cabin was an abstract concept, a memory of rock and pine that now existed only under a suffocating blanket of white. Time lost its sharp edges, measured not by the sun, but by the slow consumption of the woodpile and the dwindling sacks of flour and beans. A strange, quiet domesticity settled over them, born not of affection, but of necessity. Claire, finding idleness an unbearable companion to her anxiety, took it upon herself to tend the fire, her movements economical and sure. She learned the cabin's rhythms, the way a certain log would hiss before it caught, the particular groan the roof made under a fresh load of snow. She swept the hearth, kept the water bucket filled with melted snow, and mended the tear in her wedding dress with a needle and thread from Elias's small sewing kit. She folded the dress and put it away in her satchel, donning a spare flannel shirt of his that hung on her like a shroud, and a skirt she fashioned from a spare wool blanket. The act of shedding the dress felt like a final, belated funeral. Elias watched her. He was a silent, constant presence, his observations as unobtrusive as the falling snow. He saw the efficiency in her hands, the way she'd never wasted emotion. He saw the deep-seated weariness in her eyes, a shadow that the firelight could not touch. He sensed she was a creature accustomed to walking on eggshells, to making herself small and quiet to avoid notice. On the third day, as she was kneading a rough dough for bread, he spoke, breaking a silence that had stretched for hours. "Your husband, what was he like?" Claire's hands stilled in the flour. She kept her eyes down, focused on the pale, sticky mass. "He was a merchant," she said, the lie coming easily, polished by practice. "Older than me. He was a respected man in our town." She chose her words with the care of someone crossing a frozen river. "He took ill this past spring. It was quick." Elias said nothing for a long time, just watched her hands resume their work, a little faster this time, a little more forceful. He did not believe her. Not entirely. He had seen men lie for profit, for pride, for their lives. He had seen women lie for the same reasons. Her story was a smooth, worn stone, with no jagged edges of genuine grief. It was a story designed to be accepted without question, and that, more than anything, made him question it. He saw the subtle tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders were permanently braced for a blow. He sensed a story of violence behind the placid tale of illness, a truth she was hiding not from him, but from herself. He did not press her. He had his own truths he kept buried. He spent most of the daylight hours outside, a restless energy driving him. He chopped wood with a relentless, punishing rhythm, the axe rising and falling, each blow a strike against the ghosts that haunted him. He checked his snares, returning with a rabbit or two, his face numb with cold, his beard caked with ice. He was a man who was more comfortable battling the elements than navigating the quiet confines of a shared room. One evening, as the light began to fail, Claire felt a prickle of unease. Elias had been gone longer than usual. The wind had picked up again, and a fresh squall was lashing the cabin. She paced the small space, her shadow long and distorted in the lamplight. She would go to the window, see nothing but a swirling vortex of white, then turn back to the fire. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep, every creak of the logs a sign of his return. When the door finally burst open, it was not the steady, controlled man who had left, but a staggering figure who fell more than walked inside. Elias slammed the door shut and leaned against it, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. His left arm was torn and bloody, his coat ripped from shoulder to elbow, and a deep gash on his cheek wept blood that was already beginning to freeze on his skin. Claire gasped, her own fear forgotten. She rushed to his side. "What happened?" "Wolf," he grunted, pushing himself away from the door and stumbling toward a chair. "Got careless. Came out of the white. One of the pack that's been getting bold this winter." She needed no further explanation. Without hesitation, she took command. "Sit, let me see." She stoked the fire until it blazed, adding precious logs without a second thought. She brought the lamp closer and gently, carefully, helped him out of his ruined coat. The flannel shirt beneath was soaked with blood, The wounds were deep, a series of parallel claw marks and a vicious bite on his forearm. Her revulsion was eclipsed by a fierce, protective instinct. She fetched a basin of warm water and clean rags. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the wounds, her touch surprisingly gentle. Elias sat rigid in the chair, his jaw clenched, his eyes closed. He did not flinch, but she could feel the tremors of pain that racked his body. He was a man accustomed to enduring pain in solitude, and her presence, her touch, was a violation of that grim principle. As she worked, her fingers brushed against the scarred skin on the back of his hand. The old burns were smooth and raised compared to the fresh, raw wounds of the wolf. She felt the history of his pain, layers of it written on his flesh. The cabin was silent save for his harsh breathing and the soft splash of water. The physical closeness was an intimate thing, a language spoken in the space between them. She could smell the snow and blood on him, feel the heat radiating from his skin. A silent, dangerous tension sparked in the air, a current that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It was the friction of two solitudes colliding, and neither of them knew what to name it. When she finished binding his arm with strips of clean cloth, her hands lingered on his skin for a moment longer than necessary. He opened his eyes and looked at her, his gaze intense, unreadable. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of thanks, and the moment was broken. The storm, as if angered by their brief truce, unleashed its full fury that night. A great shuddering crash from the back of the cabin jolted them both from their separate corners. They found the small back door, used for storing wood, torn from its hinges and lying on the floor. A gaping wound in the cabin wall through which the blizzard howled and poured snow. The storm was inside with them now.
"The woodpile!"
Elias shouted over the roar.
"It must have shifted against the door."
He moved instantly, grabbing his hammer and a pouch of long nails. He fought his way to the opening, the wind tearing at him, and dragged the heavy, snow-covered door back into place. It would not hold. The frame was splintered. He looked around wildly, his eyes landing on a set of heavy storm shutters he had been meaning to install before winter.
"Hold this!"
he yelled to Claire, gesturing to the door. She threw her weight against it, the freezing wood biting into her palms, her body a fragile barrier against the tempest. Elias dragged one of the heavy shutters over. It was a monstrously heavy thing of thick planks and iron braces. He wrestled it into place against the inside of the doorframe.
"Stand back,"
he ordered. He began to hammer, the blows of the hammer a desperate drumbeat against the storm's roar. He drove long nails through the shutter, deep into the logs of the cabin wall, pinning the broken door shut, sealing them in completely. The sound was deafening, the effort immense. Claire stood behind him, shivering, watching the muscles in his back and shoulders bunch and strain with each powerful swing. He was a force of nature himself, a man battling the wilderness with iron and will. When the last nail was driven home, the roar of the wind was suddenly muffled, reduced to a dull moan. Silence, heavy and ringing, fell over the room. Elias stood with his back to her, one hand still braced against the shutter, his chest heaving. The cabin was secure. It was a tomb, but it was secure. Claire took a hesitant step closer. The terror of the storm breaking in had stripped her bare, leaving only a raw, primal need for safety, for human contact. She reached out, her hand hovering just inches from his back. "Don't let go of me tonight," she whispered, the words so quiet they were almost lost in the ringing silence. He turned slowly. His face was grim in the flickering lamplight, the fresh cut on his cheek a stark red line. He saw the undisguised fear in her eyes, but he saw something else there too, a reflection of the same desperate loneliness that resided in him. He closed the small distance between them in 2 strides. He did not speak. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was rough, desperate, and hungry. It was the kiss of 2 people who had forgotten the meaning of softness, of 2 souls starved for a touch that was not violent. It tasted of blood and snow and the bitter coffee they had been drinking. His good arm came around her, pulling her tight against him, and she clung to him as if he were the last solid thing in a collapsing world. It was a drowning man's grasp, a soldier's last stand. Then, just as suddenly, he pulled away. He staggered back, a look of profound guilt twisting his features. He raised his scarred hand and looked at it, as if the sight of it disgusted him.
I can't,
he rasped, his voice thick with self-loathing.
I don't deserve softness.
Claire looked at him, her breathing ragged, her own fears momentarily forgotten in the face of his pain. She reached out and touched the cut on his cheek, her fingers gentle. "I'm not soft," she whispered, her voice gaining a strength she did not know she possessed. "Not anymore." The next day brought not a reprieve, but a new kind of assault. Through the swirling snow, they saw them, 3 figures on horseback, moving slowly. Dark shapes against the overwhelming white. They were men from the town. Claire's heart seized with terror. They had come for her. Elias saw the panic on her face. "Get in the root cellar," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Now! Don't make a sound." She didn't argue. She scrambled through the trap door in the floor, pulling it shut just as a heavy fist hammered on the cabin's main door. She huddled in the damp, earthy darkness, listening. She heard Elias open the door. The wind and the gruff voices of men filled the space above her. "Thorn," a man's voice said. It was Henderson, the man Elias believed had burned his ranch. "We've come for the woman, the murderess." "She's not here." Elias's voice was flat, cold as the iron stove.
"Don't lie to us,"
another man snarled.
"Sheriff Dunley said he brought her here. We know she's in there."
"He brought her here the first night. She left the next morning, tried to make it over the pass before the worst of it hit. I told her it was a fool's choice. Haven't seen her since." It was a cold, plausible lie. A lie that condemned her to a frozen death in the minds of these men, but a lie that protected her all the same. Claire pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. "If you're lying to us, Thorn, if we find out you're hiding that curse in there, we'll come back, and we'll burn you out, just like the last time." Henderson threatened. The unspoken accusation hung in the air. Claire could feel Elias's rage, a palpable thing, even through the floorboards, but his voice, when he spoke, was dangerously calm.
"Get off my land, now!"
She heard the shuffling of feet, more muttering, and then the door slammed shut. The bolt slid home. She waited in the darkness, listening to the silence, until she heard his boots on the floorboards above her. The trapdoor opened, and his face appeared in the rectangle of light. "They're gone," he said. When she climbed out, she could not stop the tears. They were not tears of fear, but of something else, a feeling so foreign she could barely name it. It was the shattering, overwhelming relief of being protected, for the first time in her adult life. Someone had stood between her and the world. Someone had chosen her. She stood in the middle of the room and cried, deep, gut-wrenching sobs of gratitude. Elias did not touch her, did not offer clumsy words of comfort. He simply stood his ground and let her weep, granting her the dignity of her sorrow. The snow kept falling, but after the visit from the townsfolk, the atmosphere inside the cabin changed. The lie he had told for her was a bridge built between them. The tension did not vanish, but it was transformed. An ease settled in its place. They began to talk, their stories offered up like tentative peace offerings. One evening, a log in the fire popped loudly, and for some reason, they both started laughing. The sound, so alien in that quiet cabin, was startling. It broke the spell of gloom and left them blinking at each other, smiling. "I used to dream of being a painter," she confessed one night, her voice soft as she stared into the flames. "Landscapes. I wanted to paint big skies and mountains so tall they made you feel small and hopeful all at once." He was quiet for a long time. turning a piece of wood over in his scarred hands. "I once wrote poems," he admitted, his voice so low she had to strain to hear it. "About the seasons changing. Stupid things. They were small, fragile truths. The ghosts of people they might have been. In sharing them, they saw each other not as a burden or a threat, but as a person. But beneath the nascent warmth, the old darkness still stirred. One night, Claire was woken not by her own nightmares, but by his. He thrashed in his bed, caught in a violent dream, his voice a strangled cry. "Thomas! No, Thomas!" The name was a blade in the darkness. He fell silent then, but his breathing remained ragged and shallow. Claire lay on her furs, her heart pounding. She did not ask who Thomas was. She knew, with an instinct born of her own experience, that some ghosts were too terrible to be summoned in the light. The world was reborn in silence and blinding white. After a week of relentless howling, the storm had finally broken, its fury spent. A fragile, pale sunlight filtered through the clouds, illuminating a landscape transformed. The snow lay in massive, sculptural drifts, burying fences, swallowing sheds, and softening the hard edges of the mountains into gentle curves. The air was so still and cold it felt solid, a crystal that might shatter with a single sound. Looking out the window, Claire felt as if they were the only two people left alive in a newly created world. But survival had practical demands. Their supplies, already meager, were critically low. The salt pork was gone, the coffee was a memory, and only a handful of flour remained. "We have to go to town," Elias said, his voice flat, stating an unavoidable fact. The reprieve was over. The world, with all its judgment and hostility, was waiting. The journey was arduous. Elias led his horse, with Claire riding, through a landscape that was both familiar and alien. They followed the tops of buried fence posts. Navigating through a narrow channel, Elias had spent the morning digging from his cabin to the main trail. The sheer depth of the snow was staggering. It was a journey of hours, a slow, plodding pilgrimage back to a civilization that had already condemned her. As they reached the edge of redemption, the silence was replaced by the sounds of a town digging itself out. Men were on rooftops, shoveling immense loads of snow that fell to the street with soft, heavy thuds. Paths were being carved, tunnels connecting one building to the next. But as Elias and Claire moved down the main street, the work slowed. Shovels paused in midair. Men stopped to stare, their faces hard and unwelcoming. Women peered from behind frosty windows, their expressions a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The gossip and glares followed them like a physical wake, a cold tide of animosity. Claire pulled her shawl tighter, keeping her gaze fixed on the horse's mane, feeling the weight of 100 hostile eyes. Their first stop was the Mercantile, run by a severe, God-fearing man, Preacher Davis, who also led the town's Sunday service. He stood behind his counter, a grim sentinel guarding his wares. When Elias placed a list on the counter, the preacher did not even look at it. His eyes were fixed on Claire, burning with righteous certainty. "I'll not sell to you, Thorn," he said, his voice ringing with clerical authority. "Not while you harbor this woman. She is a harbinger of death, a Jezebel who brought a plague of murder and storm upon us. The Lord's house will not aid a sinner, nor the man who gives her shelter." Elias's body went rigid, his scarred hand on the counter clenched into a fist. "I need flour, salt, and coffee. Davis, this has nothing to do with the Lord and everything to do with you being a small-minded fool." "Get out of my store," the preacher commanded, his face flushing with anger. "You and your harlot, you are not welcome here." Before Elias could react, a man who had been loitering by the stove, one of Henderson's cronies, spoke up, his voice a leering drawl. "Listen to the preacher. Thorn, why buy supplies for a whore you're probably getting for free?" Something in Elias snapped. He moved with a speed that was terrifying. He was not the quiet, brooding man of the cabin, but the soldier he had once been. He crossed the space in 2 strides, grabbed the man by the front of his coat, and slammed him against the wall. He drew back his fist and struck the man squarely in the jaw. The crack of bone on bone echoed in the suddenly silent store. The man slid to the floor, dazed and bleeding. Elias stood over him, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a cold fire Claire had never seen. He pointed a finger at the stunned preacher. "If you, or any other man in this town, ever speaks of her that way again, I will burn this place to the ground myself. Do you understand me?" Without waiting for an answer, he grabbed Claire's arm and pulled her out of the store, leaving the scent of fear and ozone in his wake. They managed to acquire their supplies from a more pragmatic, if less friendly, fur trader at the edge of town, who cared more for coin than for gossip. The ride back to the cabin was thick with a new, raw tension. The violence hung in the air between them. As they moved through the silent, white landscape, the adrenaline of the confrontation began to fade, leaving a hollow ache in its place. Claire looked at Elias's profile, stark and grim against the snow. She saw the knuckles on his right hand, split and bleeding. He had defended her. He had fought for her. "The fire," she said softly, the question breaking the suffocating silence. "The one that burned your ranch. Henderson mentioned it. Was he the one who said it?" Elias kept his eyes on the trail ahead. His jaw was a hard line. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, scarred. "No, it wasn't Henderson." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "It was my brother, Thomas." The name landed like a stone in Claire's heart. Thomas, the name from his nightmare. "We built that ranch together," Elias continued, his voice hollow with memory. "Poured 10 years of our lives into that soil. But he got greedy. He heard about a silver strike in Colorado. Wanted to sell out. I wouldn't do it. That ranch was my home. It was all I had." His words were clipped, each one a shard of glass. He got it in his head that if he couldn't have the money, then I couldn't have the ranch. One night, he got drunk, said some things. I should have seen it coming. I should have stopped him. The self-recrimination was a raw, open wound in his voice. I woke up to the smell of smoke and the whole world on fire. He was gone. He took my horse and every dollar we had. "What happened to him?" Claire whispered. "He never made it to Colorado. Drank and gambled away the money. Got himself killed in a bar fight in some dusty town in Utah a few months later. Stabbed over a card game." Elias finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were a desolate wasteland. "They sent me a letter. I buried it with the ashes of my home. I haven't forgiven him. But more than that, I haven't forgiven myself for not being stronger, for not seeing the rot in him sooner and cutting it out before it destroyed everything. He was a man consumed by a fire that had gone out long ago, its smoke still choking him." Claire finally understood the depths of his guilt, the source of his belief that he was undeserving of peace. He blamed himself not just for the loss of his home, but for the loss of his brother, a brother he had failed to save. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was not a wall between them, but a shared space, filled with the weight of their unveiled histories. They ate in near silence, but their eyes met over the fire, and there was an understanding that had not been there before. Later, by the dim, flickering light of a single lantern, Claire knew it was her turn. His confession demanded hers. She sat on the furs by the hearth, watching him clean his rifle, his movements as always precise and controlled. "Elias," she began, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped his work and looked at her, his full attention on her. "The story I told you about my husband," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. "About him dying of an illness. It was a lie." She took a breath, the truth a painful, jagged thing in her throat. He wasn't a good man. He was cruel. He liked to drink, and when he drank, he became a monster. The memories she had kept locked away began to seep out, vivid and terrible. He never used his fists on my face, always on my body, where the bruises wouldn't show. He said a wife's duty was to be beautiful for her husband, and perfect. I was never perfect enough. Elias listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone in the lantern light. He did not move, did not speak, simply bore witness. "The night I left," Claire continued, her voice trembling, "he had lost a great deal of money at cards. He came home in a rage. He said it was my fault, that my bad luck had followed him. He started to beat me, worse than ever before. I truly believe he meant to kill me that night. I could feel the life draining out of me. There was a moment of clarity in the pain. I knew if I did not do something, I would die on that floor." Her eyes were wide, seeing not the cabin, but another room, another time. He turned to get more whiskey. My sewing basket was on the table. The scissors were in it. When he came back toward me, I had them in my hand. He lunged at me, and I raised my arm. She stopped, choking on a sob. "I stabbed him. Just once. In the neck. I didn't even mean to. Not really. It was just instinct. I just ran. I took the wedding dress Jacob Miller had sent for me to travel in because it was the only clean thing I owned. I ran and I never looked back. I don't know if he died, but in my heart, I know he did. I am a murderess, Elias, just like the people in town say." She finished, her confession hanging in the air, raw and bleeding. She expected disgust, judgment, perhaps even fear. She looked down, unable to meet his eyes, ready for him to cast her out. The floorboards creaked as he moved. He knelt in front of her. He did not say anything. Instead, he reached out, not to comfort her with a pat on the shoulder, but with a gesture of profound, shocking intimacy. He gently took her face in his hands and pressed his forehead against hers. They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, their eyes closed. The warmth of his skin was a solace. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough whisper against her hair. "I've buried bodies too, Claire." The words were an absolution. He was not judging her. He was equating his own past, his own burdens as a soldier, with hers. In that moment, they were not a man and a woman, a killer and a victim. They were survivors, equals. The physical tension that had been a low hum between them for days erupted into a roar. When he pulled his head back, he looked into her eyes and then he kissed her. It was a kiss of utter acceptance, a sealing of their shared, dark truths. It was tender at first, a question and an answer, a gentle exploration of lips and breath. But it quickly deepened, ignited by the weeks of fear, loneliness, and a desperate, aching need to feel something other than pain. He pulled her to her feet, his hands tangled in her hair, hers clutching at his shirt. They moved as one, stumbling onto the large bearskin rug before the fire. Their clothes seemed to melt away, discarded without thought. Their lovemaking was a storm, as wild and consuming as the one that had trapped them. It was a fierce, desperate claiming, a frantic attempt to erase the scars of the past with the searing heat of the present. It was a battle against the ghosts, a declaration that they were still alive. Outside, as if summoned by the tempest in the cabin, the wind began to howl once more, and a fresh fall of snow began to lash against the windows. The morning after, the world was quiet again, a clean slate. But inside the cabin, the old walls had been rebuilt. Elias was distant, his silence heavier than before. He dressed quickly, not looking at her, and went outside to chop wood. The rhythmic thud of the axe, a clear and steady punctuation of the space he was putting between them. Claire lay under the firs, a profound ache in her body and a hollow one in her heart. The intimacy they had shared felt like a dream, a fever that had broken, leaving a chill in its wake. Hurt and confused, she began to tidy the cabin, a need for order rising in her. As she was putting away a stray blanket near his bed, the corner of a small, flat wooden box caught her eye. sticking out from under his cot. Curiosity, a feeling she had not felt in a long time, compelled her. She pulled it out. It was not locked. Inside, nestled in yellowed paper, was a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and a small, oval-shaped tintype photograph. It was a picture of a young woman, dark-haired and smiling, her eyes full of a light that Claire felt had long been extinguished in her own. The letters were written in a delicate, looping script. She opened the top one. "My dearest Elias." It began. The signature at the bottom read, "Forever yours, Maria." When Elias came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, he found her sitting on the floor with the open box. His face hardened, the brief vulnerability of the previous night gone, replaced by a shuddered, defensive anger. "Who was she?" Claire asked, her voice quiet, holding up the photograph. He took the box from her, his movement stiff, and closed the lid. He did not look at the picture. He did not need to. Her name was Maria, he said, his back to her. "The letters," Claire began. "She died." He cut her off, his voice rough. "She died of fever while I was away at the war. She was waiting for me to come home." He turned to face her then, and his expression was bleak, haunted. "I never came. The war ended, but I just kept moving. I couldn't face it, any of it. By the time I finally made my way back, she was buried, a year gone." He looked past Claire, at the wall, at a past he could not escape. "Love's a cruel thing out here. Claire, it's a flower that tries to grow on granite. It dies easy." He put the box away. A final, definitive act. Claire watched him, a cold dread seeping into her heart. She looked at his face, at the ghosts in his eyes, the brother he couldn't save, the woman he couldn't return to. She had thought, for one wild, hopeful night, that they had found something real in the wreckage of their lives. But now, she began to wonder if she was just a temporary solace, a warm body to keep the cold away. She began to wonder if she was just another ghost he could not, or would not, bury. The quiet that followed their night of fevered passion was a heavier thing than any storm. It was a silence of regret, of fear, of a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. Elias moved through the cabin like a ghost in his own home, his face set in the familiar, stoic lines of a man retreating behind his walls. Claire felt the chill of his distance more keenly than the winter air. She had shown him her deepest, most shameful wound, and he had met it with his own. For a few brief, fiery hours. They had not been alone. Now, the loneliness was back, sharper and more painful than before. She was a ghost in his house, and he was haunted by too many of her kind. They were 2 days into this fragile, unspoken truce when the sound of a lone horse cut through the morning stillness. It was Sheriff Dunley. He did not dismount immediately, but sat on his horse for a long moment, his broad shoulders slumped with a weariness that went beyond the physical. When he finally swung down and knocked on the door, his face was grim. "Elias, ma'am," he said, nodding to Claire as he stepped inside, bringing a gust of frigid air with him. He removed his hat, his gaze heavy with bad news. "Jacob Miller's brother arrived on a supply sleigh from the next county yesterday. His name is Caleb. He's a loud man with a taste for vengeance. He's been stirring up the town, demanding justice for his brother." Elias stood by the hearth, his body tense. "Justice or the ranch?" he asked, his voice low and cynical. The sheriff sighed, a weary sound. "Both. I expect he's convinced Miss Abernathy here seduced his brother with the intent to rob and murder him. Says she's a black widow. He's got half the town believing it. They see the murder, the storm, and her arrival as a single, wicked knot. He's demanding a trial." Claire felt the floor tilt beneath her. A trial. Here, in a town that had already convicted her in their hearts. "There's no evidence," Elias stated, his voice a low growl. In a proper court, no, Dunley admitted, turning his hat over and over in his hands. But this isn't a proper court. This is redemption. The circuit judge is snowed in 60 miles away and won't be here till spring. They've decided to appoint Preacher Davis as the acting magistrate. Caleb is offering witness money. People are remembering things that never happened. It's a powder keg. And Caleb is holding the match. He finally looked directly at Claire. His eyes filled with a reluctant pity. They'll put you on trial, ma'am. And they will find you guilty. The words were a death sentence. Claire felt the air leave her lungs, a cold dread creeping into her veins. She was trapped. After the sheriff left, a new, more frantic tension filled the cabin. Elias began to move with a fierce, desperate energy. He pulled a heavy pack from a storage chest and started filling it with what was left of their supplies: dried meat, hardtack, a wool blanket. "You have to run," he said, his back to her. His voice was rough, commanding. "Tonight, as soon as it's dark, you can follow the river north. It's a hard journey, but it will take you out of this valley. You can disappear. Start again somewhere no one knows you." Claire stood frozen in the middle of the room. Run. It was the story of her life. Running from a cruel husband. Running from her past. The thought of spending the rest of her days looking over her shoulder, of living in the shadows, was a different kind of death. A slow, suffocating one. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as the mountains. Elias stopped what he was doing and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "What do you mean? No, did you not hear him? They are going to kill you! Claire!" "And what kind of life would I be running to?" she countered, her voice gaining strength. "A life of hiding, of fearing every knock on the door, every stranger's glance. I have lived in fear. I will not die in it. I came here to build a life in the open, under the sky. If I cannot have that, then I will face what comes. But I will not run again." Her defiance was a thing of terrifying beauty. It was the courage of a woman with nothing left to lose. He saw it in the set of her jaw, in the clear, steady light of her eyes. He saw the woman she was, not the victim she had been, and it broke him. The anger drained out of his face, replaced by a raw, naked anguish that he could no longer hide. He crossed the room and took her by the shoulders, his grip desperate. "You don't understand," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I can't." He closed his eyes, his forehead pressing against hers. The same gesture of intimacy he had offered before, but this time it was born of sheer desperation. He let out a shuddering breath, and the truth, the one he had been fighting since the night they came together, was torn from him. "I don't want to lose you too." The confession was a whisper, but it filled the entire cabin. It was an admission of love, of fear, of a heart that had been broken too many times to bear another fracture. Claire's own fear was washed away by a wave of love for this broken, beautiful man. She raised her hands and covered his on her shoulders. "You won't lose me, Elias," she said softly, "no matter what happens." They rode back to town together, two solitary figures against the vast, indifferent snow. They did not speak. There was nothing left to say. When they reached the sheriff's office, Elias helped her down from the horse. He held her hand for a moment, his scarred fingers gripping hers tightly. A final, silent promise. Then he let go. Claire walked into the jailhouse with her head held high. "Sheriff," she said to a stunned Dunley, "I'm turning myself in." The trial was a farce, as swift and cruel as the sheriff had predicted. It was held in the town's only church, the pews packed with a grim, expectant audience. Preacher Davis sat at the front, his Bible open, his face a mask of stern judgment. Caleb Miller, a big florid man with his dead brother's eyes, was the chief accuser. He painted a picture of Claire as a cunning seductress, a woman who had preyed on his brother's loneliness, lured him in with promises of love, and then murdered him for the deed to his ranch. Witnesses, their palms greased with Caleb's money, took the stand to lie. One man swore he saw her sneaking around the Miller ranch the night before the murder. Martha from the dry goods store testified that Claire had asked suspicious questions about how much the ranch was worth. Every word was a nail in her coffin. When it was Elias's turn to testify, a hush fell over the room. He stood tall, his gaze sweeping over the hostile faces, finally resting on Claire. He looked at her, and for a moment, it was as if they were the only two people in the room. "I was a soldier," he began, his voice clear and steady, filling the church. "In the war, I saw men die. I saw men kill, and I saw what it does to a man's soul. I have worn guilt like a second skin for most of my life. I know its weight. I know its smell. I know the way it hollows out a person from the inside." He turned his intense gaze on the preacher, then on the jury of townsmen. "I have lived with Miss Abernathy for more than a week. I have looked into her eyes. That woman carries the weight of sorrow, of fear, and of a pain that most of you could not imagine. But she does not carry the weight of sin. There is no guilt in her. Whatever hell she has been through, she is innocent of this one." His words shook the room. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For a fleeting instant, a flicker of doubt crossed their faces, but it was not enough. The story Caleb had woven was more satisfying, a simple tale of good and evil that affirmed their superstitions. Elias's testimony was the complicated, inconvenient truth. The verdict was delivered without deliberation. Guilty, Preacher Davis, with a grim satisfaction, pronounced the sentence. Claire Abernathy was to be hanged by the neck until dead. The execution would take place in 3 days, at dawn. They put her in one of the cells at the back of the sheriff's office. The small, barred window looked out on the main street, where a gallows was already being constructed, the sound of hammers a constant, brutal reminder of her fate. Elias did not leave. He sat on a bench outside her cell, a silent, unmovable sentinel. The sheriff, his face a study in misery, did not have the heart to make him go. That night, they shared a final, stolen lifetime. She stood at the bars of her cell, and he stood on the other side. They pressed their bodies as close as the iron would allow, their fingers intertwined. They did not speak of the gallows, of the morning, of the end. Instead, they whispered dreams that would never come true. "We'd find a small piece of land," he murmured, his forehead pressed against the cold bars, his eyes closed, "in a valley somewhere, with a creek running through it." "I would paint," she whispered back, her tears falling silently. "I would paint the sunrise on the mountains, and you would write your poems. I'd build you a house with a big window, facing east, so you'd never miss a single one. We'd have a dog," she said, a small, broken laugh escaping her lips. "A big, clumsy one. And I would never let anyone hurt you ever again." They talked for hours, building a world of words, a phantom life to hold against the encroaching darkness. Outside, their quiet whispers were drowned out by the noise from the saloon. The townspeople were celebrating. They cheered the coming execution, their voices loud and drunken, a grotesque chorus rejoicing in her death. Inside, pressed against the cold, unyielding bars, Elias wept. Silent tears tracked through the grime on his face. He had not cried since the war, not when his ranch burned, not when he learned of his brother's death. But now, the dam of his grief, a lifetime of it, finally broke. He wept for her, for the life they would never have, for Maria, for Thomas, for the endless, crushing weight of it all. When dawn approached, Sheriff Dunley gently told him it was time to go. Elias looked at Claire one last time, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a love that was now an agony. He pressed his lips to her fingers through the bars, a final, searing touch. Then he turned and walked out into the gray, pre-dawn light, a man utterly broken, The next morning, as the town began to stir in anticipation of the day's grim spectacle, the sheriff noticed that Elias Thorne was gone. His cabin was empty. His horse and his rifle were missing. Dunley stood on the porch of the jail, looking out at the fresh tracks leading out of town. Heading up toward the high, lonely passes of the mountains, a deputy asked if he thought Thorne had run for good. The sheriff shook his head, his gaze distant and sad. "No," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I suspect he's gone to dig a grave." The sheriff's assumption was a logical one, born of a deep and weary understanding of broken men. A man like Elias Thorne, who had lost everything twice over, would surely retreat into the wilderness to perform the last grim courtesy for the woman he could not save. But the sheriff did not know the promise Elias had whispered against the cold iron bars of a jail cell. He had told Claire he would never let anyone hurt her again. And Elias was not a man who broke his word. He was not riding to dig a grave. He was riding to resurrect a ghost. Under the faint, pre-dawn light that was the gallows' herald, he pushed his horse through the deep snow, not toward the lonely mountain passes, but east, along the frozen creek bed. He was chasing a memory, a fragment of a conversation he had overheard weeks ago in town, before Claire's arrival. A drunken trapper, new to the area, had been complaining about a rancher who had refused to pay him for a string of prime beaver pelts. The trapper, a man named Silas Blackwood, had described the rancher in detail and had mentioned seeing the man's mail-order bride arrive a few months prior, only to be sent away on the next stagecoach, bruised and weeping. At the time, it had been nothing more than idle, drunken gossip. Now, it was a sliver of hope, the only one he had. The journey was a brutal battle against time and the elements. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that sought to leech the life from him. His horse, a sturdy bay that had been his only companion for years, struggled through drifts that were chest-deep, its breath coming in great, panicked clouds. Elias rode with the singular focus of a man who had already accepted his own damnation and was now fighting for someone else's salvation. His own life had ceased to matter. All that remained was Claire, her face in his mind's eye, her whispered dreams of a house with a window facing the dawn. He found Silas Blackwood's camp in a narrow, pine-choked canyon, a miserable lean-to reeking of whiskey and unskinned animals. Silas himself was a gaunt, twitchy man with eyes that darted about as if expecting an attack at any moment. He was sober, which made him suspicious and mean. Elias dismounted, his body aching with cold and haste. "I need you to come to redemption with me," he said, forgoing any pleasantries. "I need you to testify." Silas spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the snow. "Testify about what? I ain't done nothing." "You told a story in the saloon about Jacob Miller, about a woman he beat and sent away months back." The trapper's eyes narrowed. "Drunk talk. Don't mean nothing." "A woman is going to hang for his murder this morning," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "An innocent woman. The town thinks she's the only bride he ever had. You know different. You saw the first one." Silas laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "That ain't my trouble, sticking my neck out for some woman I don't know, in front of that whole town. They'll skin me alive for siding against one of their own. No, sir, my memory is poor when it comes to other folks' troubles." Elias knew he had only one card left to play. He looked at his horse, his loyal companion, the animal that meant his freedom, his ability to move, to survive. It was the last piece of his old life. He looked back at the trapper's greedy, calculating eyes. "What do you want?" The trapper's gaze flickered to Elias's horse, then to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. "That's a fine horse, and a good rifle. A man could get a long way from his troubles with a rig like that." The price was everything. Elias did not hesitate. He walked to his horse and stroked its neck one last time, a silent apology. He pulled the rifle from its sheath and unfastened the saddlebags containing his few possessions. He turned and threw the reins to Silas. "She's yours, and the rifle. Now get on your mule. We ride." Meanwhile, in redemption, the town had gathered for the execution. A strange, festive mood had taken hold, a grim holiday of collective bloodlust. Snow had begun to fall again, soft, silent flakes that seemed to be trying to cover the town in a shroud of white, to hide its shame. Claire was led from her cell by Sheriff Dunley. He would not meet her eyes. His face was pale, his movements stiff. He was a man performing a duty that was turning his soul to ash. As she stepped outside, the cold air was a shock, but the wall of noise from the crowd was a physical blow. They jeered and shouted, their faces twisted into masks of hatred. They were a single, monstrous entity, and she was their sacrifice. She walked toward the gallows, her steps steady. Her tattered dress did little to ward off the cold, but she did not shiver. She had found a core of stillness within herself, a quiet place where the noise and the hatred could not reach. She was no longer the terrified woman who had arrived on the stagecoach. She was a survivor, and she would meet her end with the same strength that had carried her through her life. Preacher Davis stood at the foot of the gallows, his Bible in hand. She paused before him. "May I have last rites?" she asked, her voice clear and calm. The preacher looked at her with cold contempt. "The Lord does not hear the prayers of a murderess. You will meet your Maker with your sins upon your head." He turned his back on her. The rejection was a final, petty cruelty, but it did not break her. She ascended the wooden steps, each one a final heartbeat. As she reached the platform, a woman in the crowd, Martha from the Mercantile, shrieked, "Witch!" and threw a stone. It struck Claire's cheek, opening a small cut, a single drop of blood tracing a path through the grime on her skin. Claire did not flinch. She looked out over the sea of faces, not with hatred, but with a profound and weary pity. They did not know her. They were killing a story they had told themselves, a monster they had created to explain the darkness in their own hearts. The hangman, a burly man with a hood over his face, moved behind her. He placed the coarse, heavy rope over her head. Claire closed her eyes, her last thoughts not of fear, but of Elias. She thought of his scarred hands, the concern in his eyes, his whispered promise of a house with a window facing the dawn. She held that image in her mind, a final, defiant warmth against the encroaching cold. Just as the noose tightened, a sound cut through the jeering of the crowd. A single, desperate shout. "Wait!" Heads turned. At the end of the street, two figures appeared. One was Elias, on foot, his face a mask of grim determination. He was half carrying, half dragging the other man, the terrified trapper, Silas Blackwood. They stumbled through the snow, a desperate, ragged pair against the backdrop of the expectant gallows.
Stop this execution!
Elias roared, his voice raw with exhaustion and fury.
You are about to kill an innocent woman. I have a witness.
A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. All eyes went to Sheriff Dunley. He stood, frozen, his hand near his pistol, caught between the letter of the law and the sudden, shocking possibility of the truth. This was his town. This was his gallows. He had the power to stop it. He hesitated, his face a battleground of doubt and duty. Elias shoved the trembling trapper forward until he stood before the gallows.
Tell them,
Elias commanded.
Tell them what you told me.
Silas Blackwood looked from the gallows to the sea of angry faces, and his nerve almost broke. But then he looked at Elias, at the cold fire in his eyes, and he knew he had more to fear from this one man than from the entire town. He cleared his throat, his voice a terrified squeak at first, but it grew stronger as he spoke.
It ain't right,
he stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Caleb Miller.
That man, he says his brother was a saint, and this woman here the devil, but it's a lie. I was camped near the Miller Ranch a few months back. I saw it myself. Jacob Miller had another bride then, a little slip of a thing from back east. And he beat her. I saw the bruises on her face when he threw her back on the stagecoach. He was a mean, violent man.
He turned to the crowd. his voice rising with a desperate courage. "This woman ain't the first one he tried to own. She's just the one who fought back." The trapper's words, raw and unadorned, cracked the crowd's unified silence. The story was no longer simple. Doubt, a poisonous weed, began to snake through their certainty. People looked at each other, then at Caleb Miller, whose face had gone pale with fury. The story of a gentle rancher avenged by his loving brother was crumbling, replaced by a much uglier, more complicated truth. Preacher Davis, seeing his authority and his verdict challenged, bellowed, "This is the testimony of a known drunkard. It means nothing. Proceed with the sentence." But the sheriff had made his choice. "Hold," Dunley said, his voice a low command that cut through the preacher's protest. He looked at the hangman. "Take the rope off her." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The execution was halted. The hangman, looking relieved, loosened the noose and removed it from Claire's neck. The strength that had held her upright for so long finally gave way. Her knees buckled. She would have fallen. But Elias was already there, bounding up the steps of the gallows. He caught her, pulling her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. She collapsed against him, sobbing, not from fear or grief, but from the shattering, unbelievable relief of being alive. But peace, in a place like redemption, is a fleeting thing. As Elias held Claire, a movement in the crowd caught his eye. Caleb Miller, his face contorted in a mask of pure rage, had drawn a pistol. His inheritance, his righteous vengeance, was slipping through his fingers. If he could not have the town's justice, he would have his own. "A devil woman!" he screamed, and fired. There was no time to think. Elias reacted on pure instinct. He shoved Claire behind him, shielding her with his own body. The world exploded in a flash of light and a searing, white-hot pain in his shoulder. He grunted, stumbling back, the impact spinning him around. He saw Claire's face, a perfect circle of horror. Gunfire erupted again, but this time it was not from Caleb's pistol. Sheriff Dunley stood 10 feet away, his own gun smoking, his face grim. Caleb Miller crumpled to the ground, a look of surprise on his face, a dark stain spreading across his chest. The single decisive shot broke the town's trance. The illusion of order was shattered. Chaos erupted. People screamed and scattered, running for cover. Their bloodlust turned to panic. The execution ground became a scene of pandemonium. In the center of it all, Claire knelt beside Elias, who had sunk to one knee. His hand clamped over his bleeding shoulder. She ripped a strip of cloth from her dress, her mind shockingly clear, and pressed it against the wound, her tears mixing with the falling snow and the blood. The town had fallen into chaos, its righteous certainty shattered by a single, inconvenient truth and a final, bloody reckoning. But on the gallows, amidst the swirling snow and the screams, there was a strange and terrible stillness. Elias looked at Claire, his face pale with pain, but his eyes full of a fierce, unwavering love. They were alive. They were wounded. They were surrounded by chaos. But they were together, and for the first time, under a sky that had promised only death, they had a future. The world dissolved into a chaos of screaming and swirling snow. For Claire, the universe narrowed to a single point of focus: Elias, sinking to the blood-darkened platform of the gallows. The townsfolk, their celebratory jeers turned to panicked shrieks, became a faceless, surging tide. She was aware of the sheriff's gun barking again, a final, definitive crack that punctuated the pandemonium. But her world was the widening stain on Elias's shoulder and the pained, gray cast of his face. Sheriff Dunley was suddenly there, a bulwark of authority in the madness. He bellowed orders, his voice cutting through the noise, driving the panicked citizens back. He kicked Caleb Miller's dropped pistol into a snowdrift and stood over the body of the man who had brought a second round of bloodshed to redemption. But his eyes were on Claire and Elias. "We have to get him out of here," he said, his voice grim. The town doctor was a drunkard and a fool. The cabin was the only place Elias stood a chance. Together, they half lifted, half dragged Elias down the gallows steps, away from the scene of his salvation and near demise. The journey back through the town was a surreal nightmare. Faces peered at them from doorways, some horrified, some still filled with a sullen resentment. They were a strange procession, a woman who was supposed to be dead, a man who was dying in her place, and the lawman who had nearly hanged one to save the other. Back inside the sanctuary of the cabin, the reality of the situation crashed down upon Claire with the force of an avalanche. Elias was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his skin clammy and cold. The sheriff helped her get him onto the narrow bed before turning to leave. "I'll post a deputy outside the town's edge," he said. "No one will bother you. Do what you can, ma'am. He's a better man than this town deserves." Then she was alone. The silence was absolute, broken only by Elias's ragged breaths and the ever-present sigh of the wind. A final, vicious storm had blown in on the heels of the morning's chaos, a fitting epilogue to the town's violent drama, sealing them inside once more. This time, their roles were reversed. He was the one who was helpless, and she was the one who stood between him and the darkness. Fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but she pushed it down. She had faced her own death with courage. She would face his with the same resolve. She stoked the fire until it roared. Heating water in the big kettle, she lit every lamp, pushing back the shadows, creating an island of light and warmth in the heart of the storm. Then she turned to the wound. The bullet was still in him, lodged deep in the muscle of his shoulder. Leaving it there would mean infection, a slow, agonizing death. It had to come out. Her hands trembled as she sterilized the blade of his sharpest skinning knife in the flames of a candle. She took a long, steadying breath, her mind a maelstrom of terror and a strange, fierce calm. She had killed a man to save her own life. Now, she would cut into the man she loved to do the same. She whispered to him, her voice low and soothing, though she knew he could not hear her. "I'm here, Elias. I have you. I won't let you go." The work was a grim, bloody business. She probed the wound, her teeth clenched, her entire being focused on the task. He groaned in his unconscious state, his body arching in pain. Tears streamed down her face, but her hands remained steady. Finally, she felt the telltale scrape of metal against metal. With a final, desperate effort, she prized the misshapen piece of lead from his flesh. It fell into a tin basin with a sickening clink. She cleaned the wound as best she could, packed it with clean cloth, and bound it tightly. The hours that followed bled into days. The storm raged outside, a constant, howling reminder of their isolation. Claire did not sleep. She sat in a chair beside his bed, a silent, tireless vigil. She spooned broth and water between his cracked lips. She bathed his fevered skin with cool cloths. When the infection set in, as she had feared, and he began to shake with violent chills, she lay beside him, wrapping her own body around his, trying to warm him with her own life force. She talked to him constantly, her voice a low murmur in the quiet room. She told him about the spring, about the flowers she would paint. She read to him from his small collection of books, the words of Shakespeare and Whitman filling the space where hope was dwindling. She fought for him with a tenacity born of love and desperation, a refusal to let another person she cared for be taken from her. On the fourth day, the storm broke. Sunlight, thin and watery, streamed through the window, and in the quiet that followed, his fever broke too. His breathing evened out. The violent tremors ceased, and he fell into a deep, natural sleep. Claire, hollowed out by exhaustion, finally allowed herself to rest. Slumping in the chair, her head pillowed on her arms beside his hand, she woke to a faint pressure on her fingers. His hand, the one with the scarred knuckles, was weakly closing around hers. She lifted her head, her heart pounding. His eyes were open. They were cloudy with pain and confusion, but they were focused on her. He tried to speak, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. He wet his lips and tried again.
You didn't let go."
The words were a fragile thread, but they bound them together. A final, unbreakable knot. It was an acknowledgement of her vigil, a memory of her own desperate plea in a long-ago storm, a confirmation of the promise that had saved them both. A great, shuddering sob of relief escaped her, and she laid her head down on their joined hands and wept. Weeks turned into a month. Elias's recovery was slow, his strength returning in frustratingly small increments. Claire nursed him with a patient tenderness that was new to both of them. The cabin, once a prison of solitude and suspicion, became a haven of quiet healing. They talked for hours, filling the empty spaces of their pasts, not with grand confessions, but with the small, ordinary details of their lives. When he was finally strong enough to walk, they made their first journey back into town. The atmosphere was palpably different. The gallows had been torn down. The town was fractured, split between those who saw Claire as a victim and those who still saw her as a curse. Martha from the mercantile crossed the street to avoid them, her face a mask of bitter resentment. But the fur trader nodded a greeting, and a few of the other men, sobered by the bloodshed, offered quiet, respectful nods. The law, in the form of Sheriff Dunley, was now a constant, steadying presence. He made it clear that the matter was closed, and that any trouble directed at Elias Thorne or Claire Abernathy would be met with the full, unyielding force of his office. Then, slowly, miraculously, spring arrived. It came first as a sound, the gentle dripping of melting snow from the eaves of the cabin, then as a scent, the rich and damp smell of thawing earth. The great, white silence was broken by the rush of the newly freed creek and the chirping of birds. The mountainsides, stark and white for so long, began to show patches of green, and then, as if overnight, the meadows erupted in a riot of color, a carpet of blue and yellow and red wildflowers. The world was being reborn, and with it, so were they. Claire, using charcoal from the fire and smooth pieces of birch bark, began to paint again. She sketched the mountains, the creek, the face of the man who slept beside her. Color came back into her world, and into her soul. Elias, his arm still in a sling, began to work too. He spent his days at the site of his old, burned ranch. He did not have the strength to rebuild entirely, but he cleared the blackened debris, salvaged charred but usable timbers, and began to lay the foundation for a small new barn. They were acts of faith, a quiet declaration that they believed in a future. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and violet, Claire stood in the open doorway of the cabin. The heavy storm door that Elias had nailed shut was propped open, letting in a soft, fragrant breeze. She breathed it in, a scent of pine and damp earth and possibility. She heard him come up behind her. He didn't speak. He stepped close, and for a heart-stopping moment, she felt a flicker of the old fear as he placed his hands on the doorframe on either side of her, his body pressing her gently against the wood. But when she looked up at him, there was no desperation in his eyes, no hunger born of loneliness. There was only a deep, quiet, and overwhelming love. He leaned his forehead against hers, his gaze holding hers. "Claire," he said, his voice low and steady. "This life, it's not going to be easy. This town will never forget what happened. There will always be hard days. There will always be another storm." He paused, and she could feel the gentle rhythm of his heart. Would you stay, even knowing that? It was the most beautiful, most honest proposal she could have ever imagined. It was a promise not of ease, but of endurance. She looked into the eyes of this man who had fought for her, who had nearly died for her, who saw her not as a broken thing but as his equal.
"Only if you hold me when it gets harder,"
she replied, her voice thick with emotion. He kissed her then, a kiss that was not a desperate claiming, but a sacred vow. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke and springtime and the promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. They were married a week later, not in the church that had condemned her, but in a small clearing deep in the woods, under the silent, ancient watch of the tall pines. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, dappling the forest floor in gold. Sheriff Dunley and his wife, a kind, quiet woman named Sarah, were their only witnesses. There were no bells, no sermons, no crowd of judging eyes. There was only the whisper of the wind in the trees and a simple promise made between two people who had walked through hell and found a piece of heaven in each other. Their love did not erase their pasts. The scars on his hands were still there. The shadows of memory still flickered in her eyes. But their burdens were no longer solitary. Their wounds, now shared, became a testament to their survival. They had something to live for now, a love that was both fierce in its protection and tender in its care. That night, back at the cabin, a summer squall rolled in from the mountains. The wind rose, and the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the roof. A low rumble of distant thunder echoed through the valley. A year ago, the sound would have sent a spike of terror through her. Now, she felt a flicker of the old unease, but it was a faint echo, a ghost of a fear that no longer had power over her. She turned from the window and looked at Elias, who was watching her, his love a tangible presence in the warm lamplight. She went to him, her heart full. "Don't let go of me tonight," she whispered, the words no longer a plea of a terrified woman, but the soft request of a beloved wife. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the thunder rolled again, closer this time. He looked down at her, his eyes clear and full of a certainty that was as solid as the mountains around them. "Never again," he answered. Thank you for joining us around the fire for this story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect with fellow fans of the frontier. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.